This is the second screenshot video on the concept of agreement. In our first screenshot video, which went along with the notes posted, we talked about offer. And in this screenshot video, we're going to talk about acceptance, and we're also going to talk about uh, revocation of an offer measured with an attempt to accept, and more of that later. But let's just talk about acceptance. So if we can imagine we've got a valid offer that's been extended, and let's make it simple and say to one person, an offeree, and the offer is pending, it's not irrevocable, nor is the time for it to lapse happened. It's not been terminated by any other means. So now the offeree wants to accept. And what is a valid acceptance? And a valid acceptance is uh, by a communication or made by a communication from the offeree that shows that the offeree has unequivocally accepted the offer. The idea of it being unequivocal means simply that there's no doubt that there's been a communication of acceptance. If you make an offer to me and I say something to you like, sounds good, that's not going to do it. It's not clear enough. On the other hand, if I were to say I accept, obviously that's unequivocal. Not that one has to say I accept, but it's got to be a communication that leaves open no doubt that there's been an acceptance. The question, and it takes a little bit longer to answer, is when is a valid acceptance effective? And if you remember in our first chapter, so to speak, and I know we don't have the book, but in our first posting, we talked about unilateral contracts and bilateral contracts. And a unilateral contract is one where there's an offer that can only be accepted by the performance of an act. A reward would be a good example. And in that situation, then the offer is effectively accepted when that act has been performed. So, as I say, it's the performance of the act called for in the offer that constitutes not only an acceptance, but also the point in time when the acceptance is effective. The second category that we talked about is when we have a bilateral contract. For example, a contract to enter into a real estate contract, or if you will, a contract that is a real estate contract, better said. In such a situation, we have an exchange of promises. So now, if we look at an offer to enter into a bilateral contract, we're not going to have, as in a unilateral contract, the performance of an act called for in the offer. We're looking at some kind of communication made of acceptance by the offeree to the party making the offeror. And the key uh, point is the acceptance becomes effective when it is made, transmitted in accordance with the terms of the offer. So what we're learning here is the offer itself can set forth how it is to be accepted. I could say in an offer, acceptance will be effective only upon personal notice to me. Sometimes, however, an offer does not specify how it is to be accepted, in which case the acceptance is effective at the time the acceptance is communicated, provided that the medium of acceptance is reasonable under the circumstances. And I use an old fashioned illustration. There was a time, basically, when people communicated just by mail. So if I were to mail you an offer, so now I'm the offeror, and the offer doesn't state how it is to be accepted, if you mail back acceptance and provided that your communication is clear that you're accepting, then the acceptance is effective when you deposit the letter in the mailbox. This is kind of interesting because what we see is that I'm mailing you an offer, and at the point of time your acceptance is effective, I don't know that you've accepted. Once again, your acceptance is effective when you drop that letter in the mailbox, but I don't know as the offeror that you've yet accepted. And so what's interesting there is we have an effective acceptance, even though the offeror hasn't yet learned of it. If the medium or mode of acceptance is not authorized, for example, you text me an offer and and you don't say how it is to be accepted, but I decide I'm going to accept it by driving down your street where you live with a sign on top of my car saying I accept your offer. That's not an authorized mode because it's not reasonable. But even in that case, if the medium of acceptance is not authorized, it nevertheless will be effective if it's received by the offeror. So to continue, kind of my silly example, if I'm driving up and down your street in my car with a sign on top of the car telling you I accept the offer, and you happen to be leaving your residence and you see it, that is the sign. At that point, the acceptance has become effective. Now, our setup that we're going to look at is this. We've got an offer out there, if you will. It's valid, hasn't been terminated. And the offeree, the person to whom the offer has been made, wants to accept, but also at about that point in time, the offeror has changed his or her mind and wants to revoke. So we can have an interesting situation where the parties are acting at cross purposes, and we've got to see how that plays out. So the first order of business is, when is the revocation of the offer effective? And the rule is simple. When the offeror seeks to terminate the offer by revoking it, the termination becomes effective when the offeree learns of the revocation. So let's keep it simple. I've made an offer to you and it's pending. It's not irrevocable though, so I have the ability to revoke it. And I see you in a coffee shop and I walk up to you and say to you, by the way, that offer has been revoked. At that point in time, the offer, the better said, the revocation is effective. But what happens, and this is where it gets a little bit interesting, when the offeror is seeking to revoke an offer, at the same time, the offeree is seeking to communicate acceptance. And I reference a problem in the book, but you don't have the book, but that's okay because I've given you the facts of the case, so to speak. So on a Thursday, Dennis mails a valid offer to Tanya at her office to sell her his car. Now, 2 days later, on Saturday, Dennis changes his mind and he sends a fax transmission to Tanya's office to revoke the offer. Tanya, however, is not in her office on Saturday. So let's stop. That means when the fax transmission reaches her office on Saturday, she hasn't learned of the revocation and it's not yet effective. And indeed, Tanya doesn't go to her office over the weekend. And on Monday morning, on her way to work, before she gets to the office, she drops a letter of acceptance into a mailbox, and the letter is properly addressed to Dennis. Stop. At that point, because her acceptance has been transmitted in a reasonable mode, remember the mailbox rule, when she drops that letter into the mailbox, her acceptance is effective. And note that she has not yet learned of the revocation of the offer, and yet, not in yet, but the revocation won't be effective until she learns of it. So the revocation of the offer by Dennis would not have been effective until Tanya learned of it Monday morning. But, as I've been saying, before she learned of the revocation, she had used a reasonable mode of acceptance, the mail, to communicate her acceptance. Her acceptance, therefore, becomes effective when she dropped the letter of acceptance into the mailbox. So what I would ask you to do, there's a lot of words that I've used just because we've got a couple of things in play, but just ponder this for a while, and I think it's going to make sense to you. If you've got, as in any other time in the course, a specific question, send it to me by email and I'll answer it. And by the way, it really isn't useful and I'm encouraging you to communicate it if you don't understand it, but do your best to be very specific. In other words, uh, uh, let me give you an example. I don't understand the example you used because, rather than I don't understand the example you used. I don't understand the example you used because, and then we'll fill in the blanks. Maybe it is because I don't understand why her acceptance was effective before the offer was revoked. And then I would answer, well, that's because the offer isn't revoked. We have different rules here. The offer is not revoked until the offeree learns of it, and before she learned of it, she had effectively accepted. But play around with this a little bit, and I think it'll make sense. So this will end this video.